To continue my presentation, I've defined social capital as social resources that are embedded within a social network. And social capital is known to increase resilience, or at least foster it. Some examples of that, as seen on slide 18, are accessible disaster services, are a type of social capital, and an aspect of increased resilience, as is client-centered disaster social services, and organizational and base to improve the consensus and voice for local people, and a higher capacity of civil society for emergency management. The next slide, 19, is simply a sociogram of a social network. The circles represent actors, the arrows of various thickness, relationships, social resources in the social capital conceptualization are access to those relationships. Slide 20 shows or talks about volunteers and the way that they can foster disaster resilience. They are an aspect of social capital. They provide a resource during disasters for disaster response and recovery. And volunteers can also help to coordinate the emergency management system. Beginning on page 21, or rather slide 21, is a study I conducted a number of years ago. That study looked at various aspects of social capital and its effect on resilience and the ability to evacuate an area before a disaster. This study was done in a hurricane-prone area, and it's actually on the Gulf Coast of the United States. It's New Orleans before Katrina. Slide 23 shows a graphic of census tracts. They are shaded yellow, orange, or red if there are high percentages of households within that tract with lower or poverty level kinds of incomes. The cross here indicates disaster service organizations that have a high degree of outreach capacity. As we can see to the right and lower parts of this graphic, there are not that many organizations serving low-income neighborhoods, at least organizations with high outreach capacity. The next slide shows the same thing. Here are organizations that have a high capacity to provide services for at-risk populations. There are 4 of these crosses lined up near the right side or the right edge of this picture. It's a vertical line. These are actually organizations that are outside of the geographic area. And so removing those, we can see once again the lack of organizations with high capacity to serve special at-risk populations. And finally, slide 25 shows that in areas with high percentages of African Americans or Black Americans, yellow, orange, and red is anywhere from 40 to 100% of the households being African American. We see few disaster service organizations serving these areas. And in conclusion, this study showed that individuals 75 years old or older and low-income individuals or households were much less likely to be served by organizations, nearby organizations with high evacuation capacities, particularly that were linked into the rest of the disaster network. And so, in conclusion, as seen on slide 27, those types of things that cause vulnerability and reduced resilience tend to be poverty and social exclusion. We can see from research, other research on vulnerability theory and resiliency theory, that communities with highly functioning local governments, strong disaster agency bases, a coordinated disaster service systems and mitigation projects all of these aspects of communities foster community resilience. However, segregation or concentration in areas with poor physical infrastructures, lower amounts of social capital, and fewer social support networks tend to have less resilience. Slide 28 states that vulnerability and resiliency analysis should be part of the social development and disaster management process. One should, working with the population in a community, look at the strengths of that community, the strengths that may be leveraged for social development. These strengths tend to be aspects of disaster resiliency as well. And to reduce vulnerability and disaster and day-to-day vulnerability, resiliency and those factors that lead to resiliency need to be fostered and improved. Low social development, in fact, is a major factor related to disaster vulnerability. Slide 29 shows some aspects of organizations that are related to community resiliency. And finally, slide 30 discusses how having joint training exercises among disaster service organizations increases the social capital of organizations and individuals and helps to provide services or accessibility of services to individuals most vulnerable in disaster. And so, in conclusion, vulnerability and resiliency approaches and research have great promise in fostering the disaster resiliency of communities and helping to reduce losses by reducing disaster vulnerability of at-risk populations.